Hey, Tom or Sandra, if somebody is calling on the, oh, I see, on the phone, how do they get unmuted?
I would have to unmute them.
Okay. I believe Angelique Hamilton from ISBE, she's calling in. I think her number is the 217524.
All right, she is unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Great.
Thank you.
Sound good. Good morning, everybody. We will be starting in just under 2 minutes. If you have just joined, there is an attendance sheet we'd like you to fill out. It's actually just a Google form, and we will paste that in the chat box. If you could just sign in, as well as let us know if there's other of your team members with you, that would be great. And let us know if you're having any technology issues. We can try to troubleshoot that within the next couple of minutes. You should all be on mute. And if you'd like to share your webcam, you can. Okay, good morning, Jennifer. So you should see a Google Doc link. That will be what we would keep track of attendance. So if you could fill that in, that would be great. Okay, one more minute and we will be starting. Let's see. There's a question about the call-in number. Let's see.
I'm getting it right now.
Thank you. Okay, if you guys are not talking, it would be great if you just mute your line, which is on the bottom left-hand corner. There's an icon that'll pop up on top of the presentation. So if you could mute yourselves if you're not talking, that would be wonderful. Good morning. My name is Fannie Lee. I'm with the Midwest Comprehensive Center. Today we're going to be having a great session on transitioning to competencies, exploring definitions and entry points, our first of 3 sessions for our Problem of Practice series. I'd like to start off by just introducing Angelique Hamilton. She's our representative from the Illinois State Board of Education. She'd like to give a short welcome to everybody.
Thank you, Fannie. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. As Fannie said, I'm Angelique Hamilton from the Illinois State Board of Education, and as you know, the Illinois State Board of Education launched a competency-based education pilot program to support competency-based education in the state, along with other innovative practices. So for the past 2 years, our partners, Midwest Comprehensive Center, has offered an array of supports, including trainings, coachings, book studies, and guidance. The following virtual Problem of Practice series has been developed to provide support to pilot sites that are early in their competency-based education journey. So I welcome everybody, and I thank you for the Midwest Comprehensive Center, Fanny, and Building 21 for joining us today, and I'll turn it over back to Fanny. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. So today we're going to be starting our problem series practice. Today we have with us facilitating our discussion is Sandra Mamuchis and Tom Gaffrey from Building 21. And both of them have extensive experience in education. Sandra has 20 years as a teacher, literacy coach, and educational consultant. She has knowledge about individual instruction, professional development, and curriculum design. She and Tom co-designed the Learning What Matters framework, which you might hear about today. Also with Sandra today is Tom Gaffrey. He's a former math teacher and director of educational technology. He's also a Microsoft Innovative Educator, Master Trainer, and founder of What If Partners. So these are definitely great people to be learning from. So he has led a lot of professional development sessions for teachers and school districts throughout the U.S. So the problem series practice is a 3-session series starting today, and the next session will be at the same time, 10 to 11 a.m. Central on March 1st, and the last one will conclude on March 8th. Today's session is called What are competencies and how are they assessed? And the second one is what are the different ways to transition to competencies? And our last session will be how is student progress tracked and reported in a competency model? We have some expectations of you all who are joining. We'd really encourage you to commit to attending all 3 sessions. That way you can see the full spectrum about learning about CBE. And if you are from the same district, it'd be really great if you all sat together so you can kind of ruminate about the topics discussed and also, on the side, talk with each other. There will be some homework that is suggested after each session, and it would be really great if you can complete it prior to the next problem of practice session. One wonderful thing that the Building 21 staff are offering is a 1-hour free coaching session for your pilot site. So probably we will be signing up shortly after the series ends, and you get to talk about your own individual or school or collaborative problem or something that you're interested in with one of the Building 21 staff. So if you are in a collaborative, it'd be great if you coordinated together to find the best time. And again, if you are just joining, we have an attendance form. It's in our chat box. If you haven't seen it in the chat box, I will post it one more time. We would really like to just keep track of who's coming in order to follow up, and also just to, just let us know who is here in your team. And I'll give it to Tom.
Thank you. Folks, before we jump in, I just wanted to cover a couple technology norms. This is what you hopefully all see in your Zoom window. Zoom is the client that we are using for the webinar today. Your microphone and webcam are controlled in the bottom left corner of the toolbar. Now the toolbar disappears automatically, so you might have to bring your mouse cursor down to the bottom of the window. Please stay muted the whole time, and feel free to share your video. It's helpful for us as we're talking to see faces. We feel like we're not just sort of shouting into space. We're actually talking to people. And then the chat you can find in the middle section. One thing that might be on your computer that's different than mine is you might have three dots to the right of that middle bar. Chat might be hidden in there. Please use the chat to ask any questions. We're going to use it as a back channel. We'll try to answer as many questions throughout the webinar. If we don't get to some questions, we will absolutely follow up. We'll read the chat afterward and follow up in an email with everybody. And just so you know, this session is being recorded and we will be hosting it. on, as part of our open resources. And let's get started. Oh, one more thing. Throughout this slideshow, which you will have access to, I'll eventually post it in the chat. You're going to see this this little icon. Whenever you see this icon and you open the slideshow up on your computer, you'll be able to click on this icon and get to a resource or a source that our information is based on. These are used throughout all of our slides. So let's jump in and get started. So this is the first of three, and today we're going to be defining competencies and talking about how they are assessed. I'm myself, Tom Gaffey, is with you with Sandra Ramuchis from Building 21. The only additional things I'll say about myself is, as part of Building 21, my main responsibilities are coaching of our schools and districts that are in our network, as well as designing our IT platform that supports our model. Sandra, do you want to jump on and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandra, and I am the Chief Instructional Designer for Building 21. I co-designed our competency framework, which we are going to talk about today, Learning What Matters, as well as our studio instructional model. And I work with Tom to coach and support our schools, the schools in our network.
So Building 21 is a nonprofit, and we specialize in partnering with districts and schools to literally reimagine what school can look like. And when we started this work 5 years ago, we didn't start out to be competency-based. We started out because we wanted to create a different idea for what school could be. And we designed that model and only came to the conclusion that competencies was a tool to use to help realize our model. And the way that I would characterize our model is that we try to break down the four walls of the school through project-based learning and industry partnership. And competencies allow us to do that more effectively. Now, the reason we wanted to do this is because of what we call the factory model of school. So when we think about school and what it was designed to do, what the purpose was, we believe that its purpose was, quite frankly, to get really good at sorting students. And if you look at different parts of the model and how things are structured in courses and credits and how school days work and how school years work, it's really it's a really effective way at letting kids go through a standard pathway and figuring out which kids are ready for certain types of life experiences. And we think that schools should actually have a different purpose. And so that purpose that I talked about, which is, finding kids' passions, having them sort of leave the four walls of the school and work with industry partners, people in the community doing project-based learning, we realized that there are structures that exist that make that harder. And so there are four structures that we seek to replace. Time-based structures, which is one everybody is familiar with. School happens in a certain amount of time, learning happens in a certain amount of time, and everybody sits in a seat for that same exact period of time. And then there are age-based structures. When you constrain your school structures to time, what you end up, the result is you get students that move with other students of similar ages, regardless of where they are on their learning pathway. And then there are course-based structures, which aren't inherently bad, but we think that the way that courses are coupled with credits, that really constrain schools, because typically you have to, you get a credit, and that credit is based on number of credit hours, and that hours is based on seat time, and that seat time is organized in a course, and that's where learning happens. But actually the best way to organize knowledge is probably not within a siloed course. Knowledge is inherently cross-disciplinary. Students are constantly making connections. And so we don't think the course-based structure is the best way to organize learning. And the last one is what we would call grade-based. And so grade, we would say, are traditional letter and 100-point scale grades. Those are not very good ways to inform students about where they are, the growth that they made, the progress that they're making. In fact, it actually obfuscates all learning into a single metric for a given course. And so when you think about really changing school, and you keep all of these, or even some of these, you have to ask yourself, what exactly are you changing? Or if you could change these, could you make school be more flexible and start to think about time differently and start to think about space differently? And so that's what we seek to do. We seek to create a model to make learning more personalized for students by replacing these structures with something different. And we believe that's what competency-based allows us to do. And if you talk about the purpose of our work, is when you start with the argument that school is designed to sort students, by definition, that is not equitable. And so when we say we're trying to replace those factory model structures, we're seeking to replace them with something that is more equitable for students. And so the field of competency-based education at its heart is equity. And we are trying to create a model that is just more equitable for all students.
So when we started this work, we just had this idea that we were going to do competency-based education, and we were just going to find some competencies that were, out there somewhere and use them. And what we found was quite different. When we started this work, we really didn't find anything that we could just use. And so in looking through resources, we came across Competency Works. And in 2011, they had about 100 innovators come together and try to define what competency-based education was. And so this was the working definition that we started with to try to develop our own competencies, since they didn't exist at the time. And so we focused on these 5 things. We wanted our competencies to be very explicit and measurable, so that it was students and teachers knew exactly what was required for the competencies, and we wanted to develop a system that allowed students to advance upon mastery. So what does that mean, and how does that look? It was part of what we had to figure out. What does that mean to advance upon mastery? And then we had to really think about our assessments, because in order to do competency-based education has implications for your assessments. And so we really had to move to performance-based assessments that allowed students to demonstrate their learning in a more meaningful and positive way. And a huge part of our model became this idea of revisions and feedback, and using these indicators that we wrote that address the skills that students need to learn as a way to give students feedback about what they needed to do to demonstrate mastery, and that they could always improve and they could always continue to grow. And so again, the learning outcomes for students had to be application-based, where they could demonstrate their knowledge and do something with what they learned in order for us to see if they demonstrated the competencies. So that's where we started. And we created a competency framework. That's where the Learning What Matters framework came from. And it was very much based on competencies and policies and how to rate kids and how do students advance and all of the kind of nuts and bolts of that. And then I think we weren't the only ones. Many of us realized as we got into this work, this transformation into competency-based learning is about so much more than competencies. And so in 2017, we were part of a national summit on K-12 competency-based education that worked together. It was teachers and principals and district leaders and researchers came together to really identify what were those other things that were so essential to making this transformation to competency-based education. And out of that came these 16 quality design principles. And you can see in the link, the little arrow box, it's a link to the whole publication that came out from Competency Works. But there are really 3 categories of principles that were essential. And so you have to start with your competency-based model with a shared vision and a purpose. And the foundation of this model is about relationships and about shared beliefs and a set of mindsets that are essential to do this work. And that's really what the purpose and culture principles are about. And the teaching and learning principles are talking about what it takes to the shift in instruction that needs to happen. There's no one instructional model that is recommended for competency-based education, but there are implications for your instruction. As we talked about, performance-based assessment is essential, but also this idea of agency and student ownership of their learning, and relevance is super important when you're thinking about your instructional model. And then the third sort of category of principles was around structure. And these are the operations, the organization, how you use your resources, how you schedule teachers and students and your day, and where learning happens, how learning happens, and also this idea of educators as learners and providing that time and opportunity for those professional development opportunities. And so all of these principles have implications for designing your model. And so thinking about how these principles are present in your model and what that looks like as from an organizational perspective, from a culture perspective, and from a teaching and learning perspective is part of the work of that initial visioning and planning of your school model. And now I'm going to turn it over to Angelique, who is going to talk specifically about the requirements for this pilot.
Thank you, Sandra. So the ISBE requirements for a competency-based education model on your screen, they demonstrate mastery of all required competencies to earn a graduation credit or credit towards graduation. Demonstrate mastery of adaptive competencies. Those are better known as your employability competencies, defined by the school district in addition to your academic competencies. Students would advance once they have demonstrated mastery, and those students would receive more time in personalized instruction to demonstrate mastery as they move through the competencies. Another requirement is that students have the ability to attain advanced post-secondary education and career-related competencies beyond those needed for graduation, such as dual credit, or anything related to perhaps career and technical education. Another requirement for an ISBE CBE model is being assessed using multiple measures to determine mastery, usually requiring an application of knowledge. That's such as portfolios, student portfolios, or project-based learning. And then finally, be able to earn credit towards graduation in ways other than traditional coursework, including opportunities outside the traditional classroom. Those would include things like supervised career development experiences, work-based learning, internships, summer programs, and possibly community service projects where the learning is not time-based or seat-based, but in the model that Tom and Sandra were talking about, you're learning all the time, you're learning constantly. And so how can we get those, capture those experiences that the students get outside of the classroom? Sandra?
Thanks, Angelique. I appreciate that. So there's the national work that we talked about, and then Angelique just talked about the work at the state level. And we're going to try to represent all of that in the next 3 sessions, but we're going to ground it in our work. Not because we want to sell you what we're doing, but because we tried to be really bold and we tried to go really far with our model. And so we think that telling people about how we're doing it is the best way that we could get, inspire different people to do different kinds of models. And so Sandra mentioned that we developed a model called Learning What Matters Competency Framework. And it's a full competency framework that not only includes competencies, but includes all rating tools, all policies, and lots of different ideas of how to implement this in lots of different contexts. And so if we talk about, all of our work that we do is shared under a Creative Commons licensing. It's all open and free. And the way that we've organized this work is into 5 categories. Not all of these are actually competencies. So the more traditional one is our core content areas. So we have academic competencies in your content areas that you would expect: ELA, social studies, math, science, visual art, world language, and health. And those are really focused on those academic skills. And then we have our habits of success, which is actually a little bit different than most people use habits of success. In our habits of success, we focus on what habits people need to be successful. Often people couple that with social emotional learning, and we've actually decoupled that. And our social emotional learning competencies became our personal development competencies. Those are very different in that only students assess themselves. Adults don't assess students in their personal development competencies. And then the next gen essentials competencies, those are your 21st century skills, your employability skills. What are the competencies needed for the next generation of work? And then at the top, you'll see wayfinding experiences. Now, these are unique to what we're doing, and they're not actually competency-based. What we said is there are these experiences and artifacts that students often have to create in personalized models. And they're really important to our model. Things like capstones, college visits, post-secondary plans. Usually those have to be embedded in some bigger course for credit. What we're saying is in our model, those individual experiences are all individually credit-based and graduation requirements. And so that's what you're looking at here. All 5 of these areas become our next-gen graduation requirements. And all of this work is inspired by something called NGLC My Ways Student Success Framework. If you have not heard of that, I really recommend looking at it. I think it's the smartest work out there on the profile of a graduate. NGLC created 20 competencies based on tremendous amounts of research on what industry partners are saying, post-secondary partners are saying, and what their cohort of personalized schools that they support are saying about what students need to be successful. And the way that the field typically talks about competencies is in 2 different buckets. You have your academic competencies and you have your adaptive competencies. So in the next 3 sessions, we're going to be using our competency framework a lot. And so I wanted to give you guys just how the different buckets that we break it up in and how they roll up into those 2 main buckets. And so our core content competencies are our academic competencies. That's only a fifth of our framework. Our adaptive competencies are actually broken up into our next gen essentials and habits of success. And those are your 21st century skills and your skills for being a successful person. And then we decoupled social emotional learning from that, but those are often typically called your adaptive competencies. And then wayfinding experiences doesn't really have a bucket in the field yet. And so that sits outside of it. And just to get everybody grounded into what we call a competency, or an example of what we would consider a competency, here is our ELA set of competencies. There are 7 competencies, and you can see they are written, the actual competency statements are written in student-facing language. And this makes up, this is an example of what we would consider an academic competency. There's a question on there about where can we get a link to the My Way Student Success Framework. Whenever you see the icon in the bottom corner of any of these slides, it's actually a link to that work. So when you guys get a link to this slideshow, you can actually click on that there. And when we started this work, I kid you not, when we first got into this work, the first thing that we had to do was figure out what is a competency? What's the difference between competency, mastery, and proficiency? And nobody had an answer. This was 5 years ago. But over the course of our work in this, we've actually created a definition that we use. And the definition is actually very similar to how ISBE would define it. And so the ISBE definition is a learner competency is a broad overarching concept supported by a cluster of standards that can be applied across disciplines and outside the classroom. That's actually very similar to how we would define it. But what we found is a lot of people mistake a competency and a standard. And so in that definition that I just said, a competency is a cluster of standards. And that's true. But we think there's more nuance there that would help people understand the actual, what we would consider the differences, especially in the way that our framework works. And so there are 6 differences that I want to talk about. And the first one is context and purpose. So typically, a standard is written by a teacher or an educator to be used by a teacher to generate curriculum. And the difference between that and a competency is written for a student to understand what they need to know and be able to do, to understand how much they need to be able to grow in order to be college and career ready. The next would be grain size. So when you look at a standard, when you look at a whole standard, a set of standards, and you read each standard, they're actually very different. Some standards contain several skills. Some standards might contain one skill. Some standards might span across multiple levels. And so there's not a standard grain size for a standard. In a competency, typically what people do is they create an even grain size, and a competency sits above standards. It's a cluster of skills or standards. And the next would be focus. So typically standards are used to explain not only content skills, but also content knowledge. And they're used in order to organize courses. And so if you break down course-based structures and replace it with something different, standards don't really work as well anymore. What competencies are designed to do is to be very explicit about transferable skills across multiple domains. So by definition, competencies should be cross-disciplinary. They should be able to be picked up and used by anybody for any purpose, regardless of what that organizing learning structure is. And then the gradation is really important because typically a standard is course-based. It defines a course, which is defined by a grade level. But when you create competencies, you try to build out those competencies along a progression of learning or growth. And that progression is a transparent way to define readiness. And that progression is then used to communicate to students where they are and how much they need to grow. When it comes to assessment, a standard is many standards, not all standards. Many standards can be assessed by low-level Bloom's or Webb's depth of knowledge, recall and comprehension. The difference is all competencies should be written in a way that demands performance-based assessment. Competencies as transferable skills must be application-based at the very least. And so that's your high-level Webb's depth of knowledge. And then the last one's really important. So how should grading systems be designed when you use competencies? And so, well, with standards are most commonly still associated with traditional courses that get traditional grades. But competencies exist along a continuum. And what that means is there should be no failure inside of that framework because it's just about where you are on that continuum. And we know that that's really difficult to get out of those traditional structures. But if you think about what is our aspirational goal with replacing the factory model? And one of the worst things that we do to kids, in our opinion, is we have this structure called failure. And in a competency-based system, that shouldn't even exist. It shouldn't even compute that a student can fail at something. Because if you're on a continuum, you are where you are and you know how much you need to grow. And so that's how we define it more broadly. And hopefully we can take this definition and show you lots of different ways that this can be done.
And we really spent some time diving into thinking about grading across the three systems. And so, you know, traditional grading's been around, people accept it. Nobody really questions how people get their grades. You end up with 100 or an A or a C, and that's just what it is. Standards-based grading tried to move to sort of decoupling all those other things like homework and participation and, you know, things that didn't really address academics, and sort of say, we're going to assess you on a set of standards. And these standards are usually assessed on a 4-point rubric, and we're going to, you know, tell you your proficiency on those standards. And where we've tried to go with competency-based education is really making learning transparent across the day, across teachers, across the years, across schools. One thing as a parent I've recently and continually experienced is going to back to school nights and going from teacher to teacher. I have middle school and high school children, and sitting in on classes, and one teacher will say, okay, homework counts for 20%, quizzes count for 30%, and tests count for 50%. Then I go into the next teacher and they say, oh, I don't count homework, it's all tests. And then the next teacher will say, I just add up all the points and I divide by the total points, and that's how we get the grade. And so it's all arbitrary and at the discretion of the person who's standing in front of the class. Standards-based instruction makes that a little bit more consistent. You have a rubric, and at least you can see sort of the criteria, but it's hard to measure that against knowledge or growth over time. And one of the things we think is really powerful about the continuum of learning and all of our competencies, they go from kindergarten to 12th grade. They measure the same skills, and we can actually measure very transparently longitudinal progress and growth. So students are always being measured against the same standard. If I walk into this teacher's classroom or this school or this, you know, experience, students will say, this is how I'm being assessed and this is what I'm accountable to no matter what. And so there's a ownership that students can now take of their learning, and there is a structure and consistency in knowing no matter where I'm going, this is what I'm being held accountable to. And that has really become powerful for students, and something that doesn't exist in a lot of traditional schools. And there's a link, again, when you get this, do you want to open that link? Okay. We just kind of mapped out in a document, like sort of all of the things about traditional grading versus standards-based grading versus our version of competency-based assessment, from thinking about the structures of it, the grading policies of it, the types of assessments that you can use. Again, we've talked about the need for performance-based assessment. And then there's also implications for your systems, how you're tracking this, what your grade book looks like. And so down at the bottom, it just shows you kind of a traditional grade book where you input numbers or letter grades, and they all just kind of get averaged together based on how it's weighted. Standards-based grading could use 1 through 4 rubrics, could use words, you know, proficient, partially proficient, advanced. And then our system is based on ratings on our continua. So it's all numbers that all come together for a competency set to a performance level. And it's all portfolio based. So students have to reach a certain performance level for a portfolio, and that's how they are awarded credit. And so as you move into this work, thinking about how you're going to assess competencies and what the implications are going to be for your systems and how you're going to track this and report this is really important. And that's why we're spending the whole third session talking about that.
So here's an example of when we say continua, this is what we mean. A continua is a progression-based rubric. And so whenever you see an example of our continua, those are the rubrics that all teachers use to rate student work. And here's how they're structured. So this is an example of one of our adaptive competencies under Habits of Success called Building Networks. And so that's the competency, and the competency statement is the I can statement underneath of it. And so the way that we organize this, the taxonomy of this, is that skills are nested underneath competencies. And this is just one of 4 skills that are in this competency, seek support and resources. And for each skill, there is a progression that we call a continuum. And the way that this progression works is when a student, when you observe a student doing something, some kind of performance, or you're looking at an artifact, you take a look at each performance level and you start reading the language. So if a student was, if a student was sort of doing some sort of reflection or presentation on how they've built their network, you would look for evidence for each of these indicators underneath of the performance level. And when you see, when you read each indicator and those indicators match what the student is performing, then that becomes their rating. And so, for example, if what they're doing matches the 2 ratings under 6, then you would go to 8. And if it doesn't match any of these indicators under 8, then you would say, okay, that student's rating, their current performance level for that skill is a 6. And then, there's some nuances to this. There's ways to get in between. There's some rules to follow there. But in general, this is the rubric, and that students have, that teachers have, that they get their ratings. But here's a really important thing. Many people first ask, are those grade levels? They are not grade levels. In fact, when we think about what personalizing a pathway looks like, we have to understand that if a student wants to do something like maybe a VOTEC school or a community college, there's going to be different readiness levels than if a student wants to go to a really prestigious university or a full 4-year university. And so what we say is there's a personalized pathway that students have some control over that is completely transparent to them. And so for us, the minimum graduation level for our competencies is level 10. And that means that you could be successful in community college, you could go to a 4-year university, you might need some remediation. And we're not perfectly scientifically validated there, but we've done quite a bit of work from our students that are doing dual enrollment, and they go and write an essay. They bring their A essay back, and we rate it on our continua, and it often matches 10s on our continua. So not scientifically validated, but certainly anecdotally. And then if a student is able to get 12s while working in one of our schools, they're already working at college level. If they can reach 12 on our continua, they're ready for college. They're doing college level work. They should be put into a dual enrollment program. And so that's how we can start to communicate to students very transparently. If your goal is to go to this college or this university, then your goal is to try to get your 10s or 12s. Sorry, Sandra, go ahead.
And as I mentioned before, one of the important pieces of our model is about longitudinal progress and growth. And we firmly believe that it is actually growth that we should be tracking and measuring for students. We know a lot of the students that we work with are coming in significantly below grade level. And so having them be able to see the growth that they're making along this continuum is one of the most powerful things we've been able to do. And to really ensure each year that students are making growth from the year before and not measuring growth just within that same year has been really important. So our ultimate goal is to set individual growth targets for students for each of the competencies, where they come in and where they need to end on our continuum based on their personalized pathway. And that's something we're in the process of working on. But when we wrote these, we really had to figure out what we were trying to accomplish. And, as we've talked about often, a lot of our work is rooted in a set of principles. And so even our our competency and continua writing is rooted in positive youth development. And so we really are about agency and ownership for students. Tom, can you go to the next slide? That's the one I'm talking about. Yep. So these are the design principles, and they really match not only our mission statement, but also our core values. And this is where we started when we thought about how are we designing this assessment system for students? So we wanted to have transparency. All of our language is written in student-facing language, and it is written for students so that they know exactly what's expected of them and where they need to go to be ready to graduate. And then this gives them a lot of ownership to be able to design their own pathways and figure out where they need to go and what they want to do. And this is also helping them understand the purpose. So why am I doing this? And it's completely outlined for them. This is why. These are the things you need to do, and these are the habits and the skills and the mindsets that if you develop will help you be successful. And then we also want students to be able to make an impact. So this is also, what do they need to do with their learning? How can they take this learning and apply it in really authentic ways to their lives and the community? And as Tom mentioned before, really being grounded in equity and making sure that students all have access to learning and are also being held accountable to very high expectations. And so as you dive into this work, and if you are thinking about designing your competencies or writing your continua, these are kind of the criteria for thinking about writing those indicators for your competencies. As I mentioned, they have to be student-facing. Not only are these written for students, these are written for teachers. So our continua is the backbone of instruction. Instruction has to start with your performance assessments and the continua that you're using and the indicators that you're rating so that you can do a backwards design process and ensure that your instruction is matching those indicators. So teachers and students are all aware from the very beginning how they're being assessed. Feedback is given based on these student-facing indicators, and students know exactly what they need to do to get to the next level. When you're writing these indicators, it's important that the language is observable and measurable. Sometimes you get very, excited about what you want kids to know and be able to do, and I've done this a million times. I've written these indicators, and I'm like, oh, that sounds great, and teachers will say, how am I supposed to measure that? And I can't observe that, and that's not something I can see. So always checking to make sure that the language is observable and measurable and able to be rated. And that it matches, it's developmental, that it builds and gets more complex. And that's what Tom just showed you, that bolding in the continua he just showed you before shows how it gets more complex from level to level.
Sandra, I'm going to talk about this for observable and measurable. That's right. So when we say something's observable and measurable, here's an example. So this is we have a competency for presentation. And you're looking at two different versions of the level 10 indicators for presentation. And I use presentation in conference workshops several times a year. And when we do like a calibration protocol, like a student work norming protocol. And one of the indicators in the early version was I can engage my audience with a compelling hook. And no matter what I did, no matter how good of a moderator I could be, and no matter how well I tried to explain our intent, people would get angry about this indicator. And they would argue with each other. They would argue with me. That introduction wasn't compelling. It's too subjective. And so after, 2 or 3 years, Sandra and I sat down when we were rewriting the continua, and she said, all right, what do you notice when you're doing this norming session? And so I brought this up, and we really tried to write language. And you would think, like, just change the language. It's easy enough. But like, it took a long time to get to the second indicator, which is our current indicator, which is I can use an engaging hook to get the attention of my audience. So it's not a huge change, but you wouldn't believe the way that this changed the entire dynamic of a whole workshop that I do with teachers on the calibration protocol. And it's just changing compelling into getting the attention of the audience. And now think about that difference. Compelling is this word that's very subjective. Who's it compelling to? But then getting the attention of an audience is something that you can look for. It's something that you can search for evidence. And when you really get into this work and you start writing these things, you will argue over language all the time because it's really hard to find that right mix of words that is observable and measurable.
And then where I struggle is in the distilled part, trying to just get the least amount of words that communicates exactly what the performance looks like and is very instructive. And so we have another example of something I'm working on right now. I'm working on teacher competencies, and I'm starting with sort of the highest level of language. And so if you read that fourth indicator, I regularly and systematically use tools, progress lookups, student and teacher PLPs, competency and task dashboards to understand individual skills, gaps, strengths, weaknesses, interests, and aspirations of each student, and use the information to design and modify personalized learning paths toward meeting performance level and growth targets and completing portfolios. And then you're like, wait, what? Like, what am I supposed to do? So it starts with kind of like all these ideas of what you want this to look like, and then really trying to get, okay, what is the essence of this? How do I simplify this, but keep the rigor and keep the high level expectations that I want? And so that's the work. You kind of start with aspirational, and then you sort of, get feedback and break it down. And then one thing that is also different, from how we wrote our competencies and continua is that they're content agnostic. So again, to be able to measure the same skills over time, you have to be able to measure those skills across all contexts and all content. And so there's no content knowledge that's present in any of our competencies. It's all content skills. And our suggestion to everyone is that you use your state's content standards to design your learning experiences so that the content becomes the context through which the students are demonstrating their mastery of the competencies. And so there's a link here to just sort of our thinking, a blog post about how we think about content. Yes, content is important because without content, there's no learning, but measuring these skills over time across the different content areas and the different contexts is what we think is super important to track and measure. And then we have an alignment of all of our competencies and the language from our continua come from national standards. So if you click on that link, it'll show you the crosswalk to Common Core, Next Gen Science Standards, to the C3 Framework for Social Studies, National Art Standards, the ACTFL ICANN statements. That was all used to inform our work to make sure that this was a national model and not just specific to any one area or one state's standards.
So we're gonna start closing up this session, and the one thing that I could probably imagine is just how much many of you are swimming in all of the different language that we introduced. And I'm not sure we're good enough at what we do to figure out how to do it better. So we thought, let's throw it at them and then try to tease it out over the next 2 sessions. So just know you can ask the questions in the chat. We'll try to define things for you, and we'll try to spiral back over the next 2 sessions. But just know that our framework, the Learning What Matters framework, is not the only framework that exists. In fact, there are lots of other frameworks that we used as inspiration, and that there are lots of frameworks being developed currently that are very similar to the Learning What Matters. And so we put some of those links here in this slide. And so obviously there's a link to our full set of competencies. South Carolina developed at the state level, developed a set of competencies that are very similar to ours. We included New Hampshire's course level competencies and New York State's SCL benchmarks. And then one of the early inspirations for our work was Summit Public Schools' cognitive skills rubric. So you have access to all of that there.
Wait, can you stop for a minute? I want to say 2 things before you go on.
Sure.
One, the South Carolina work is interesting because they started with their portrait of a graduate, and they said they wanted to make their portrait of a graduate meaningful. And so they worked with Redesign to, which is in full disclosure, Sydney, who works for Redesign, is part of the co-designers of the competency model. So when you dig into South Carolina's competencies, you're going to notice some are in our competency sets as well, because Sydney and I wrote those together. So reading critically and expressing ideas, you're going to see in multiple places. But what was really interesting, their approach, they said, we have this portrait of a graduate, And we really want to make it more meaningful. So how do we create a set of competencies that can be measured, that can measure that portrait of a graduate? And so they have their competencies that are tagged with some, each competency is tagged with a part of their portrait of a graduate to show the connection between the two. And so that was a really interesting approach. And then New York is doing some interesting stuff with SEL, and they are, right now it's optional, but they're in the process of turning those into competencies, and they have the language of progressions written out for their SEL benchmarks. So that's a good recent example to look at. And then what's interesting about Summit is they sort of broke out their cognitive skills rubric is separate from they still have a very traditional kind of playlist model that they go through and is assessed on mastery, some percentage of mastery. But then through their projects and other opportunities, they're assessing these other skills. And then separate from that, they have this continuum for habits of success. So it's interesting to think about the different approaches as you go through this, that, how people are implementing their competencies, how they're thinking about the competencies in relation to their vision for what they want their model to look like.
So we have a small homework assignment for you all, and the homework assignment is contained on a Google form that's linked in this slideshow. But essentially what we want you to do is we're interested in learning about your why. Why are you coming to this work? And we think it would be a really good first step that if you could put your why in a couple of sentences to be able to, what's your elevator pitch for the reason that you want to move to competency-based? What problems are you trying to solve? And so that there's a place for that in the Google form. And the other thing is we gave you some links to many different competency sets. And so we thought it would be a really good idea over the next 2 weeks to be able to browse through all the different competency sets and try to make your first list of competencies. Are you going to just focus on adaptive competencies? Are you going to focus on competencies for your different academic courses? How are you, what's your initial draft? It doesn't have to be final. It doesn't have to be comprehensive. Just look through, get a sense of how different people are organizing the work, and put some on a piece of paper and submit it on the Google form. And if you do that, I think you'll be ready to go into the next session, which is going to be now that you know what competencies are, you've seen examples of it. What are different entry points into the work? And so that's really what we're going to focus on for the next session. We're going to try to be very concrete and have some bigger implementations and then some really small scale implementation examples. And then the last one, I think it's going to really kind of tie all these new terms together. We're actually going to demo our systems that we've been using with many of our schools to communicate progress. So that finishes up the first session. I will post a link to the Google form assignment in the chat. There's also, I posted several times the link to the slideshow. You could also feel free to reach out to myself, Sandra, or Fanny with any questions, comments you might have. And Sandra and I have not done many webinars. And so we have no idea if this was any good. We want to get better. And so we just have a very simple evaluation. It's just a plus delta Google form. Please give us some ideas on how we can make this better and tell us how we made this one helpful. And with that, I'll turn it over to our facilitators. If you guys have any closing comments.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra and Tom. Really great. Tom, can you also put the evaluation link into the chat box so that people can just immediately click on it?
Yep,
Terrific.
done.
Yeah, so really glad you can all join. We have 2 minutes. If you have any questions that any of their discussion has spurred please feel free to unmute yourself and ask it, or you can type it in the chat box. We have just a couple of minutes left. I know there was a lot of information thrown at you, and we really encourage you to try out answering, you know, what you think are some of the competencies you want to attack as part of your homework. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to bring up at this point? Also, please remember to fill in the Google link here for the attendance so we know who's here. And if not, we'll let you go. And please do come back and bring your colleagues so that we can dive in more next time on the next part. Appreciate everybody joining. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
See ya.